So, the thing I keep coming back to when I think about The Walking Dead, the whole sprawl of it, the 11 seasons of the main show, plus all the spin-offs that came after, is that underneath the zombies and the chases and the cleared throat dramatic monologues, the show was really, mostly, a very long-running argument. People sat at tables and on porches and in the backs of vans, and they argued about what to do next. They argued about who to let in. They argued about who to keep out. They argued about how much of who they used to be they were allowed to hold on to, given everything. And the show kept going long enough that you could watch the same arguments come back around in slightly different rooms, with slightly different people sitting at the table. And every time, somebody at that table would lose. Somebody would say a thing the group dismissed at the time, and the group would do something else. And then 10 episodes or 2 seasons or 6 years later, in a different show, in a different country, with a different cast, the universe would quietly turn around and say, well, actually, that person had a point. That is the thing I want to talk about for the next couple of hours. Characters who were right all along, not in a smug way, not in a told you so kind of way, because most of them never got the satisfaction of being told they had been right. A lot of them died before anyone got around to it. A few of them spent so much time being dismissed that by the time the show came around to admitting their position had been the correct one, they had already moved on with their lives, or someone else's life, or a different community, or the afterlife. I find this kind of thing more interesting than the big dramatic moments, honestly. The deaths everyone remembers are the ones with the bat or the boat or the helicopter. Those are great pieces of television, sure, but the moments that hold up best on rewatch, for me, are the small ones. 2 people on a porch having a disagreement neither of them know is about something bigger than it looks. A character at the edge of a barn arguing for an idea that the group is about to vote down. Someone walking back from a fence, finally figuring out what they should have figured out 3 episodes ago. Those moments don't grab you the first time through. You watch them as filler. You go and make a cup of tea. It's only on rewatch, when you already know how things played out for the next 4 seasons, that you go, oh, they were right. Nobody listened. They were just sitting there being correct in front of a group of people who had already made up their minds. Now, before we get going proper, just a quick note. If you're new here and you like falling asleep to long Walking Dead stuff, the subscribe button is there whenever you fancy it. No urgency, no big production, just useful for the algorithm. Anyway, that's enough of that. So the way I want to do this is just to wander through 13 of these characters, one at a time, and talk about what each of them was right about, and what it cost them, and why I think the show kept doing this thing where it would let a character be correct, and then either kill them or exile them or quietly write them off screen for 2 seasons. Some of these characters are obvious choices. There's a fan theory that's basically as old as the show that says one specific person in season 2 was right about everything, and we'll get to that. Some of them are less obvious, some of them lost arguments at the time, and then spent the rest of the show being slowly vindicated in ways the show would never quite admit out loud. This is not a ranking, by the way. I don't really do rankings on this kind of thing. The characters sit alongside each other. Some of them were right about huge philosophical questions, about what it meant to keep your humanity in a dead world. Some of them were right about really specific tactical things, like we should not be keeping a barn full of corpses on the property, or this guy with the eye patch is not someone you want to do business with. All of those count. Both kinds of being right matter, especially in a show where the small tactical mistakes and the big philosophical ones tend to feed into each other until they end up being the same mistake. I should also probably say up front that I am going to be drifting around between the original show and the spin-offs as we go, because some of these characters have arcs that run all the way through to Daryl Dixon in France, or Dead City in Manhattan, or The Ones Who Live, or whatever AMC is calling the next one by the time you watch this. I'll try not to spoil anything that needs to land cold, but if you've genuinely never seen any of it, and you're using this as a sleep video, fair enough. I'm about to absolutely demolish a few storylines, and you can just let it wash over you. That's the deal with sleep videos. The point isn't really to follow every beat. The point is the voice in the dark. The other thing worth mentioning, just so we're on the same page, is that I'm not going to pretend any of these characters were perfect, or that being right about one thing makes them right about everything, or that I personally agree with all of their decisions. A few of them I would not let into my house. One of them I would actively run away from. The point isn't who you'd want as a flatmate. The point is who, on the specific question they were trying to argue at the specific moment they were arguing it, turned out to have been correct. And on the subject of one specific argument that has been going on in the Walking Dead fandom basically since the show started airing, there's no real way to do this list without starting where it really started, on a farm in Georgia, with a cop in a buzz cut who slept with his best friend's wife, killed a man with a backpack full of medical supplies, and tried, in his own incredibly broken way, to make people see what the world had become. Whether you like him, whether you think he's the villain of the early seasons, whether you think the show framed him fairly or not, you cannot have a conversation about characters who were right all along on this show without starting with him. So we're starting with him. So, Shane was right. If you have spent any time at all in the Walking Dead fandom, you've come across this argument. It's been going on since 2012. It will probably still be going when the last spin-off ends, whenever that is. Two camps, the Shane was right people and the Shane was a monster people, both of them very confident, both of them digging up the same scenes and reading them in completely opposite ways. I want to talk about Shane because I think both camps are partially correct. And I think the most interesting thing about Shane is that the show, if you look at it across the next 9 seasons, basically agreed with him on the facts and then refused to let him be the one who said them out loud. Quick refresher in case it's been a while. Shane Walsh was Rick's best friend, his patrol partner, and the man who pulled Laurie and Carl out of King County when the world ended. He thought Rick was dead. He started a relationship with Laurie. He kept Carl alive. He set up the camp at the quarry outside Atlanta. He was, in the very early days of the apocalypse, doing the job, keeping a group of people fed, defended, and roughly together. And he was doing it without help. Then Rick came back, and the dynamic Shane had built his life around in a few short weeks fell apart. That's where the show found him. And from that moment forward, the audience was meant to slowly stop trusting him. The thing is, when you actually watch his arc, and you put aside the way the show frames him, his read of the situation is almost always correct. The walkers are not sick people. The barn at Herschel's farm should not have been full of corpses. The group needs to know how to shoot. The group needs to be willing to make hard calls about strangers. The group cannot keep doing what Rick keeps doing, which is to extend mercy to people who are going to come back and burn the place down. Take Randall, the kid they picked up at the public works station. Randall was part of a group of around 30 heavily armed men who had, by his own admission, done some genuinely horrific things to women. He had heard the location of the farm, maybe not the exact coordinates, but enough. Shane wanted him put down. Rick spent half an episode tying a noose, walked out to do it, and then changed his mind because Carl was watching. Dale, who we will get to in a moment, argued for keeping Randall alive on principle. Shane lost that argument, and then Shane went out and broke Randall's neck himself, faked an attack, and tried to lure Rick into the field to do the same thing. The show treats this as the moment Shane finally goes too far, and fair enough, breaking your friend's neck after framing him is not great behaviour. But here's the thing, Randall was never going to work out. The only reason his group never showed up at the farm with 30 men was that the herd got there first. Shane was right about the threat. He was wrong about how to handle it. Those are two different kinds of wrong, and the show kind of runs them together. The barn is the cleanest example. Herschel's barn at the farm, packed with walkers, the whole group walking around eating breakfast next to it like it was a tool shed. Shane looking at this and saying, openly, that this was insane. Shane being told to back off and let it go because they were guests, and Herschel had his reasons. Then Shane finally hitting his limit, breaking the barn open, shooting the walkers as they came out, and then Sophia, who they had spent half a season looking for, walking out among them. The show frames this as Shane finally cracking, but the barn was always going to have to come open. Shane was right that pretending otherwise was killing them slowly. And Otis is the one I find hardest to talk about, because what Shane did to him is genuinely indefensible. He shot a man in the leg and left him to be eaten so he could escape with the medical supplies for Carl. There is no way to frame that as a good action, but the cold reading is that Carl lived because of it. Shane made the calculation that one of them was going to die at that high school, and he made sure it was the other man. The show punishes him for it. It's the moment his hair starts coming out in clumps. It's the secret that erodes him for the next 10 episodes, but the calculation, in pure terms, was correct. Without those supplies, Carl was gone, and the rest of the show doesn't happen. Personal opinion, and you can disagree with me freely on this. I always thought the show actually agreed with Shane on the facts, but couldn't let him be the one who said them, because he was sleeping with Rick's wife, and lying about how Otis died, and unravelling in front of everyone. The arguments were sound. The man delivering them was not. And so the show kept letting him be the dark mirror, the version of survival logic, with all the moral cushioning stripped off, and then arranged for Rick to gradually become him over the rest of the run. Because here's the bit I find genuinely fascinating, and you can watch the show all the way through with this in mind, and just clock every time it happens. Rick does the things Shane was advocating for. He just does them later, with better lighting and a more sympathetic score. The Saviour's War, the ear-biting in Season 4, the execution of strangers on the roadside, the "We are the Walking Dead" speech, the decision to clear out Terminus and not look back, the moment in Season 5 when Rick stops trying to save the people who can't be saved. Every single one of those is something Shane would have done on day one, and the show treats Rick doing them like a tragic descent, while it had treated Shane doing them like a moral failure. The difference is just packaging. Shane was right that this world required a different version of yourself, and Rick spent a decade catching up to that, and the show let Rick get there with all the dignity intact, while Shane got a knife in the chest and a bullet in the head from a kid in a sheriff's hat. I don't think this means Shane was a hero. He absolutely wasn't. He was unstable, he was dangerous, he was making decisions in his own self-interest while telling himself they were for the group. He was also, on most of the actual questions in front of him, looking at the situation more clearly than anyone else in the camp. Both of those things can be true at the same time. There's a great little detail right at the end of his arc. After Rick stabs him, after Carl finishes the job, the herd that the gunshot draws ends up overrunning the entire farm. The thing the group had been arguing about for half a season, whether or not the farm could last, was answered the same night Shane died, by the world giving them their answer in the form of 1,000 walkers. He was right. He just didn't get to be there to say it. And honestly, you get the sense from the show that even if he had been there, nobody would have been listening anyway. The bucket hat. That's the thing I always come back to when I think about Dale Horvath. The bucket hat and the silver Winnebago, and the fact that he was, by a fair margin, the oldest person in the original camp, and the only one in the early seasons who seemed to have any real interest in stopping and asking what the rest of them thought they were doing. Dale was a retired hardware salesman from Michigan who had bought the RV with his late wife, intending to spend his retirement driving it around the country. He did not get to do that. The world ended instead, and he ended up with a couple of strangers on a highway outside Atlanta, watching over a group that mostly didn't know what to make of him. He kept watch from the top of the RV. He held onto a few books. He would read in the evenings while everyone else was figuring out what to do about the next problem. Here's a fun detail about Dale that I think gets missed. He was the only character in the early seasons whose job was, essentially, to pay attention. He didn't fight much. He wasn't a tracker. He couldn't really shoot. What he did was watch the people around him and try to work out where the group was drifting, and most of the time, he worked it out before anyone else did. He saw Shane changing months before anyone else would say it. He saw Andrea's death wish at the CDC and quietly refused to leave her there. He saw Herschel's blind spot about the barn and tried, gently, to talk him round. The big argument he was right about, though, the one that defines him in a way that I find genuinely heartbreaking on rewatch, that was Randall and the vote in the farmhouse. So just to set the scene. Randall is in the shed. The group has gathered in the living room of the farmhouse around a coffee table to decide what to do with him. Rick has decided to execute him. Dale has spent the day going from person to person, asking each of them individually to think about what they were about to do, not to argue them out of it, not to lecture them, just to get them to actually think. The line he says, the one that I think about a lot, was something like, "The world we knew is gone, but keeping our humanity, that's a choice." He says it to Andrea while she's standing guard outside the shed. She agrees to watch Randall against Shane, but she tells Dale that she's not doing it because she thinks he's right. He goes to Daryl. He goes to Herschel. He goes to everyone in the group, one at a time. And he loses. He stands up in that farmhouse at the end and says, "Look at us. We're not even debating whether or not to do this. We're just doing it." And nobody in the room speaks up except Andrea. The group has already moved past him. Rick decides not to execute Randall in the end, but only for accidental reasons. Carl is at the door. The moment passes. Shane handles it himself shortly after. Dale's argument never actually wins anyone over. It just gets quietly skipped past. He walks out into the field that night, alone, and a walker that Carl had failed to put down earlier in the day finds him and tears his stomach open. Daryl gives him the mercy shot. The whole thing happens fast. Dale dies under a blanket on the ground in front of his group, and the next morning the group has a small ceremony, and then everyone goes back to whatever they were doing. And here is the thing that I find sad about Dale, and that I think makes him one of the most quietly important characters the show ever had. He was right twice. He was right that something inside the group was breaking, and he was right that once it broke, they would not be able to put it back together. The show then spends 10 more seasons proving him correct, over and over and over, in increasingly large and obvious ways. Every time the group tortures someone, every time the group executes a prisoner, every time the question of "are we still good people" comes up. And that question comes up roughly once a season for the rest of the show. Dale is the answer. Dale already had the answer. There's a line he says when he's dying, in some versions of the script, that gets paraphrased as, "This group is broken." It's a small thing, a gasping sentence from a man whose insides are on the outside. But it is, basically, the next 9 seasons of television in 5 words. The group was broken. Dale watched it happen. He tried to say something. The group voted him down and then dispersed his RV's contents and divided up his books. Personal opinion, Dale gets dismissed sometimes as the naive moralist, the wishy-washy old guy who didn't understand the new world. I think that read is wrong, and I want to be a bit firm about it. He understood the new world perfectly. He saw exactly what it was demanding of people. He just refused to accept that understanding it meant accepting it. There's a difference. Most of the characters in the show, when they were faced with what the world had become, adapted by becoming harder versions of themselves. Dale's whole position was that you could see what the world had become, accept what it was, and still not let it turn you into the person it was trying to turn you into. He lost that argument. Most people in his position would have lost that argument. That's not really a flaw in his thinking. It's a fact about how arguments like that go in groups under pressure. The pragmatists tend to win the vote, and the moralists tend to lose. And then a few years later, the pragmatists tend to look at the world they've made and wonder quietly where they went wrong. By that point, of course, the moralists are usually dead. One small thing I love that the show kept doing after Dale was gone. The RV stayed in the show for a couple more seasons, sitting in the prison yard, used for runs, eventually destroyed. Nobody really commented on it, but it was always there in the background, this big silver reminder of the man who had owned it. I don't think the show was being subtle about it. I think it was a deliberate visual choice. The group kept his RV after they had stopped listening to him, which is, in a way, exactly what groups always do. They keep the artifacts. They get rid of the inconvenient voice. There's an Andrea moment, much later, where she basically has the conversation Dale had been trying to have with her on the highway after the governor has done what the governor was always going to do, and you can see in her face that she finally gets it. Dale was right. She just wasn't ready to hear it from him at the time. Honestly, that might be the most accurate thing the show ever said about how being right works in real life. Most people are not capable of receiving correct information from someone they've already decided to dismiss. The information has to come back around through somebody else, or through a tragedy, or through a few extra years of getting it wrong on your own before they can accept it. Dale had the misfortune of being the kind of person nobody wanted to be lectured by, saying the things that nobody wanted to hear, so he died in a field and the group kept his hat. There's a particular atmosphere on Herschel Green's farm that the show, for whatever reason, never quite recreated again. The wide green fields, the white farmhouse, the cows in the distance, the porch you could sit on at sunset. The whole family eating dinner at a long wooden table. Maggie washing dishes, Beth singing, Patricia laying out plates. Outside, the world had ended. Inside, you could pretend, for a couple of hours, that it hadn't. The cure for everything was on its way, and the only thing wrong with the property was that there was a barn full of corpses round the back. Other than that, perfect. I want to talk about Herschel because he's a slightly tricky case for this list. He was wrong about the big thing. He was wrong about the walkers being sick people who could be cured. He was the one keeping the barn locked. He was the one feeding chickens to the dead. The big premise of his arc when we first meet him was based on a category error about what a walker was, and the show eventually had to sit him down and make him understand it. So in one sense, he starts out his time on the show being meaningfully wrong. Fair enough, but here's why I want him on this list anyway. Once he stopped being wrong about the barn, which happened brutally in the course of about 10 minutes when his daughter walked out of it as a corpse. He turned out to be correct about almost everything else for the rest of his run. And the thing he was correct about, the thing he kept saying with quiet conviction for the next 2.5 seasons, was the thing the show, for all its grim posturing about the dead world, never actually disagreed with him on. Hope was not optional. He just believed that more honestly than anyone else. The bourbon scene with Rick is the one I always come back to. Beth has just had some kind of catatonic episode. Herschel has been gone, drinking in town. Rick finds him in a bar and they sit down and have a drink together. Herschel, very matter-of-factly, tells Rick that he had robbed his own daughters of their grief by giving them false hope. He had let them believe their mother might be cured, and he had let himself believe it. And now he had to sit with the cost of that. He's not a man who's sentimental. He's a man who's sober about his own mistakes, in both senses of the word. And Rick, in a moment that I think is genuinely well written, does not let him off easy and does not pile on. He tells Herschel, basically, that hope is not a kindness, it's a job. People are counting on them to keep finding it, and the alternative is that the people around them stop trying. Herschel listens to that. He puts the glass down, he doesn't argue. From that scene forward, for the rest of his time on the show, you watch him take the lesson and run with it. Right about Glenn and Maggie. He gave them his blessing. Walked Maggie through her grief over her mother. Watched Glenn turn into the kind of son-in-law you would actually want, in a world that did not really make sons-in-law anymore. There was a small moment I love where Glenn asks him for permission to marry her, and Herschel just nods and goes, "Yeah, all right," with the same energy as a man approving a paint colour. The world had ended. He'd seen weddings stripped down to about the level of formality they had probably had 300 years ago. He was fine with it, right about the prison flu. There's an episode where the flu starts spreading through cell block A, and the council has a meeting about isolating the sick, and Herschel basically refuses to abandon them. He sets up a quarantine ward and stays in it himself, intubating people by hand, ventilating them with little airbags, making cups of tea, sitting with them while they died, and putting them down before they came back. The show at the time framed this as borderline foolish. A bunch of the characters thought he was going to get himself killed. Looking back, I think it's one of the only moments in that whole stretch where someone in a leadership position made a choice that wasn't about pure utility. He wasn't doing it because it was the optimal use of resources. He was doing it because it was what doctors do, even veterinary doctors, even in an apocalypse. He cared for the people in front of him. And he survived it, and so did most of them, which I think the show kind of glossed over because it didn't quite fit the mood of the season. His read on the governor was correct from the moment he met the man. He was kept hostage in an RV with Michonne. The governor came in smiling and reasonable and offered him a deal. Herschel listened to him talk, very politely, and then told Rick afterwards, basically, this is a man you can negotiate with, and you should negotiate with him, because the alternative is everyone dies. Rick refused. Rick made his own pitch about the prison being big enough for both groups, and the governor responded by hacking off Herschel's head with Michonne's katana in front of his daughters. The show kills him for being right. That's the bit that has stayed with me for years. Herschel was the voice in the room saying, we can still build something. We can still talk to people. We do not have to escalate. And the show kills him to underline the point that the world he wanted to build was not a world the universe would allow him to have. The governor swings the sword, and Herschel's last expression, looking at Rick across that field, is one of the most devastating things I have ever watched on television. It's not an angry look. It's not even a sad look. It's a man who has accepted what's about to happen and is, in the last moment of his life, telling Rick with his eyes that he doesn't blame him. Here's a detail I really love and that I think gets overlooked. After the prison falls, Rick basically tries to live out Herschel's ideal version of life. They settle into the house with the others. Rick gives up his gun. He starts growing vegetables. Carl carries the responsibility of being on watch, and Rick tries to be a father instead of a leader. He's playing at being Herschel for a few episodes, whitewashing the porch, keeping the kitchen tidy, making sure dinner gets on the table. The show ends that arc by having a group of strangers attack them in the night and Rick biting a man's throat out. But for a few quiet minutes, there in the back half of season 4, you got to watch what Herschel's vision actually looked like when somebody else tried to live it. It looked nice. It almost worked. Personal note, since I'm allowed one, Herschel is probably the character whose loss I felt the most deeply on the original show. Not because of the death scene itself, although that is up there with the most upsetting moments the show ever did. It's because of who Herschel was when he was alive. The show needed someone in it who genuinely believed that hope was a real thing, and not just a trick we tell ourselves. Herschel was that person, and the show could not actually function without him. And the show then spent the next 7 seasons trying to find someone who could fill that role, and never quite did. They got close with a few other characters, Father Gabriel in his final form clergy role, Aaron sometimes, Beth briefly, but no one ever held the room the way Herschel had held it. The bourbon scene Herschel, the man who could tell the truth about his own mistakes and then sit there and let you decide what to do about it. I've watched the show twice through, and the second time I noticed how often, in the later seasons, characters would refer back to him. Not with big monologues, just little asides. Maggie particularly would invoke her father's memory at strange moments. In conversations with Glenn, with Negan, with Carol, he kept being right after he was gone. You don't get many characters like that. Andrea is a character I think we all owe a small apology to. The fandom decided very early on that she was annoying, and once that decision was made, it stuck. People would point at the governor and go, well, she slept with him, didn't she? And that was treated as the end of the conversation. I think that's a really unfair reading, and I think it cost the character more than it should have. Because if you actually watch her arc from the highway in season 1 all the way to that locked room in Woodbury, she was right about almost every actual position she argued for. She was right about wanting to fight back. She wanted to know how to use a gun. She wanted to be trained. She did not want to be on dish duty while the men handled the perimeter. The first season has this whole quiet undercurrent of the women being shoved into the laundry corner of camp, and the men strutting around with rifles, and Andrea is the one in the very beginning who pushes back against it. She wants in. She is told, basically, no, sit down. And every single thing she eventually became: a sharpshooter, a defender, the kind of person Daryl would trust on a perimeter, was a direct result of her refusing to take that no for an answer. She was right at the CDC. There is a whole reading of the CDC episode where Andrea, who had basically given up after losing her sister, was making a clear-eyed choice about her own life when she sat down with Jenna and decided to stay. The show frames it as Dale guilt-tripping her into surviving. But I think what Dale actually did was love her enough to refuse to let her quit on a bad day. And what Andrea did for the next 2 seasons was prove him correct by becoming one of the most capable members of the group. Her judgment of Shane, on the other hand, was off, and I think that's worth being honest about. She trusted Shane longer than most of the others did. She was sleeping with him for a stretch of season 2. She watched him handle the camp with quiet competence and decided he was a steadying presence. And she was wrong about that, because the steadying presence was eating itself from the inside the whole time. Fair enough, she got that one wrong. Everyone gets things wrong. The governor is the part that really sticks in people's heads, so I want to actually sit with it, because I don't think the read most people have of it is the right one. Andrea was separated from the group in the season 2 finale and ended up wandering Georgia on her own with Michonne for the better part of a winter. They got picked up by the governor's people. They got brought to Woodbury, and what Andrea encountered in Woodbury was a town that, on the surface, was working. Power, hot showers, a pub, kids riding bikes in the street, families having dinner. After what she had been through, this was not a small thing. This was the closest thing to civilization she'd seen since the world fell apart. The governor presented himself as a charming, slightly battle-worn leader who was holding a community together. He was good at it. That's the thing the show kind of hides from itself. He was actually really good at running Woodbury at first. The shadow side of him, the daughter in the closet, the heads in the fish tanks, the whole staged combat arena, all of that came out slowly. Andrea, who was also recovering from being half dead, did not have the information Michonne had. Michonne, who had been on her own for a long time and had finely tuned instincts about people, picked up on the governor inside of an hour. Andrea, who was operating on the version of him she could see, took longer. That's not a character flaw. That's just what it looks like when one person has more information than another person, and they don't share it. And the person with less information makes a decision that turns out to be wrong. What Andrea then did, once she figured out what the governor was try to broker peace between Woodbury and the prison. She walked across no man's land. She sat in a room with Rick. She tried to get the governor to a table. The show treats all of this as a doomed effort, partly because the governor was not a man who could be brought to a table, and partly because Rick had decided he was done negotiating after Herschel's head. But the impulse, finding a peaceful resolution between 2 armed groups before they tore each other apart, was correct. The show does not really credit her for it, but if you look at what actually happens to the prison and to Woodbury after the war between them goes hot, it's not hard to see that Andrea's plan, if it had landed, would have saved a lot of lives. The death scene is the part of her arc I think the show absolutely got right. She's in a locked room in Woodbury. Milton is dying on the floor next to her. He's been bitten. She's been bitten too. By him, after he turned. Michonne and Rick break in and find her against the wall, fevered, pulling her coat away from her shoulder to show the bite. And what she does next is the most Andrea thing she ever did. She does not panic. She does not ask anyone to fix it. She asks for a gun. She calmly tells Rick that she remembers how the safety works, because he had taught her on the highway in the first season. And then she sends Michonne and Rick out of the room and does it herself. She didn't need anyone to do the math for her. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was coming. She had, in the time she had been on the show, become a person who could look at her own situation and decide what to do about it without anybody else's help. And I think that's actually the bit that gets missed when people talk about Andrea. She kept becoming a more capable person, season by season, and she kept being treated by the show like a problem to be solved. Personal aside, I always come back to Andrea trying. That was her whole thing. She kept trying things that didn't work, and the show treated this like a character flaw, but she was the only person in the early seasons who consistently tried to make things better instead of just surviving them. The other characters survived first and tried second. Andrea tried first and survived second. That's a different temperament. The show needed both kinds of person, and it was only really comfortable with a survival first version. The other thing the show quietly did, after she was dead, was vindicate almost every single position she had argued for. Communities, diplomacy, training everyone to defend themselves, women included, trying to find a way to coexist with neighbours instead of going to war with them. By the time you get to Alexandria and the hilltop and the kingdom, the entire mid-show is basically Rick and the others slowly figuring out that Andrea had been correct about what their priorities should look like 2 seasons earlier, when they had been calling her naive for thinking it. She doesn't get a call back. There's no scene where Rick mentions her by name and goes, "Ah, she had a point." She just sort of hovers over the politics of the later seasons, this argument she had been making while she was alive, slowly being implemented by the people who had dismissed her at the time. The first time you see Michonne, it's the very last shot of the season 2 finale. Andrea's in the woods, surrounded, about to be eaten, and a hooded figure with a katana strapped to her back walks out of the trees with 2 armless, jawless walkers on chains and starts cutting things up. No introduction, no name. The credits roll. You spend the next 8 months waiting to find out who she was. That entrance is one of the more memorable openings the show ever did, and it sets the tone for what Michonne ended up being on the show, which was basically the most reliable instrument in the cast for reading other people. When she didn't trust someone, she turned out to be right not to trust them. When she chose to commit to a person or a place, she committed totally. There's not a lot of in-between with her, and over the course of about 8 seasons, the show kept proving her gut feelings correct. The governor is the obvious first example. Andrea, as we just talked about, took a while to work him out. Michonne picked up on him almost immediately. She walked into Woodbury, looked around, and within about a day was actively trying to escape. She found her way into his apartment. She found the fish tanks with the heads in them. She opened the closet and found his daughter chained up in the dark, half dead and gnawing at the air. By the time the governor came home, she was already standing in his living room with her sword drawn, ready to do what needed doing. The fight between them in that apartment is one of the cleanest character beats the show ever produced. He attacks her. She drives the katana through his eye. The whole rest of his arc, the eye patch, the unhinged second act, the destruction of the prison, comes directly out of that one moment. Michonne saw what he was, made a decision, and the universe gave her a clear shot. She took it. I love the way the show handles her quiet. She's not a talker. There's a specific way Michonne reads a room before she speaks. There's a pause, a beat, where she's deciding whether the question in front of her is in good faith or not. Most of the time she's correct about that too. People who are genuine, she opens up to, slowly. People who are bluffing, she clocks instantly. Negan, Alpha, the governor, even some of the people inside the group at various points. Michonne always seems to know where they actually stand, while everyone else is still figuring it out. Her instinct about Rick was the other big one. She came into a group of strangers who had just lost the prison, who were scattered, traumatised, half-starved, and within a few episodes she had decided that this man was someone worth standing with. She didn't oversell it. She didn't make a speech about it. She just picked up Carl, picked up Judith, picked up Rick, and quietly attached herself to the Grimes family for the rest of her life. That instinct, that this was the person she was going to commit to, was the most important call she ever made, and the rest of the show is basically the story of her being correct about it. Then there's the long arc, the thing the show did with Michonne that I think is genuinely interesting, more interesting than people give the writers credit for, was the Rick is Alive arc that ran across the back half of the original show and then came back around in The Ones Who Live. When Rick disappeared after the bridge, everyone in Alexandria saw the explosion, watched the bridge come down and went, all right, he's gone. They held a funeral. They moved on. Michonne raised the kids, built the community, put up the wall, and in the back of her head, something was off. Something didn't add up. She would go on these little expeditions, find a phone, find a boat, find a strange item, and she would not let it go. The community would gently suggest that she was looking for something that wasn't there. Michonne would very politely ignore them and keep looking. She was right. He was alive. She had been correct about it the whole time, while everyone around her had been telling her, with full sympathy, that she was processing her grief in a complicated way. The Ones Who Live, that whole spin-off, exists because Michonne refused to accept the story everyone else had agreed on about what had happened to Rick. That's a particular kind of being right that I find very moving. It's not tactical. It's not about a threat assessment. It's just a person refusing to give up on a feeling, and the world eventually agreeing with her. A small thing about her parenting that I want to mention. The way Michonne raised Judith and RJ, keeping Rick alive in the stories she told them. Keeping the version of him that mattered, even as the actual man was somewhere out at sea, or up in a helicopter, or wandering around a city she didn't know existed, was one of the warmest things in the late show seasons. Judith especially grew up with a Rick in her head that the audience never got to see, because Michonne built that Rick out of the best parts of him and gave that to her daughter. Judith starts using a katana of her own around season 10. There's a generation thing happening there, and it's all on Michonne. I also want to mention briefly the friendship with Carl, because that one I think gets overlooked. After they got to Alexandria, Michonne and Carl had this very natural, undramatic, easy thing where she was just sort of around. She'd have meals with him. She'd talk to him without lecturing him. She'd take him on runs. She was the one who handed him the katana to use on a few occasions, and she was the one he would go to when he didn't want to go to Rick. The relationship had been built quietly, episode by episode, without ever turning into a big stepmother arc, and the show was much better for it. Personal opinion, and I'll keep it short. Michonne is the character on the show whose judgment I would trust above almost anyone else's. If she walked into a room and went, "This is wrong, we should leave," I would leave. If she walked into a room and stayed, I would stay. That's an unusual quality in fiction. Most characters are designed to be wrong sometimes, for plot reasons. Michonne mostly isn't. She's correct about people in a way that the show treats as a kind of superpower, even though it's actually just paying attention. There's a bit at the end of the original show where Michonne rides out of the fog on a horse, with her sword and a pile of walkers shuffling along behind her, going to look for Rick. She doesn't say anything in that scene. She doesn't need to. The whole show, basically, has been leading up to her getting the chance to go and prove she'd been right. She finds him, of course. The Ones Who Live ends with the two of them coming home. And the bit I love is that she doesn't make a big speech about it. She doesn't go around saying, "See, I told everyone I knew." She just walks back into Alexandria with him, and the kids see their dad, and that's that. The vindication is quiet. The vindication is just the door opening. That, I think, is exactly the kind of being right Michonne always was. She didn't need anyone to admit it. She just needed it to be true. Here's the thing about Daryl. He hardly ever explains himself. In a show absolutely full of monologues, where every character has at some point sat on a porch and given a 6-minute speech about what they used to be before the world ended. Daryl mostly just does the thing he was going to do, and you have to work backwards from his actions to figure out what he was thinking. He grunts, he nods, he says, "Yeah." Occasionally, he tells a story about being lost in the woods as a kid, and then he goes quiet again. And underneath all of that, he had the most consistently accurate read of any situation in the entire show. I think that's the thing I find weirdly comforting about him as a character. In a show that runs on people debating each other into corners, Daryl is the one who already knows what to do. He doesn't argue his case, he just shows up where he should be and does the thing that needs doing, and then steps back. It's a rare archetype to do well, and the show, almost in spite of itself, did it well. Start with the early seasons. Daryl was a hunter, a tracker, a man who had spent most of his adult life in the woods one way or another, looking for game or running from his own family. When the apocalypse arrived, that skill set, which had been mostly ornamental for civilization purposes, suddenly became one of the most valuable things anyone in the group had. He could read tracks, he could find water, he could spot blood on a leaf. The Sophia search in Season 2 is essentially Daryl on horseback, on foot, with a crossbow, picking up trail evidence the rest of the group could not even see. He was the only one who genuinely thought she could still be found. He was, technically, right. They did find her. She was in the barn the whole time. That's not the ending he wanted, but his read on the situation, that the trail was there, and it was leading somewhere, was correct. The Merle thing is the one I want to spend a little time on, because it's the part of his arc that I think is most often underrated. Daryl loved his brother. Everyone else in the group saw Merle as a problem. Loud, racist, dangerous, the man who left a hand on a roof in Atlanta and turned up later as the governor's right-hand thug in Woodbury. Most of the group had decided, by the time Merle showed up at the prison, that he was a write-off. Daryl refused. He kept seeing his brother. He kept thinking there was something underneath all of that worth keeping. And here's the thing, he was right. Merle, in his last act on the show, took the truck, took the booze, drove to the governor's meeting place, got drunk, got most of the governor's men, and then died trying to do something useful for the only person in the world he actually cared about. He went out as a brother first and a person second, and Daryl found his reanimated body in a field afterwards and put him down. The grief of that scene is real because Daryl had been correct about Merle the whole time, and the universe had only let Merle prove it on the way out. Right about the Saviours, here's a tricky one, because the war is messy. Daryl's role in the Negan years is almost entirely as a prisoner. He's caught at the lineup. He spends a long stretch of Season 7 naked in a cell, eating dog food sandwiches, being psychologically tortured by Dwight. But what Daryl was right about, sitting in that cell, was that this fight was not going to be won by force. The Saviours were too many. Their structure was too strong. Negan was personally too capable. Daryl came out of that war a different person, quieter, slower, more inclined to step back from confrontation. And the show used that change to build the version of him that runs through Alexandria's middle years and into the spin-offs. I want to talk briefly about the spin-off, the Daryl Dixon show in France, because I think it actually proves something about him. He's in a country he doesn't speak the language of. He's surrounded by people he can't fully understand, and he keeps reading rooms correctly. He'd sit down in a kitchen with a few French strangers, none of whom he could verbally communicate with, and within 60 seconds, he would know who in the room was the threat and who in the room was the friend. The whole show, more or less, is built on the trick of Daryl being deposited into completely foreign environments and using nothing but his eyes to figure out who to trust. He gets it right almost every time. The exceptions are written as betrayals, where the people he had decided were friends turned out to have a hidden agenda, and even then, the read was usually that he had clocked the agenda, but had decided to play along anyway. Loyalty calls are the other thing he was almost always right about. Pretty much every time the group was on the fence about whether to trust someone, Aaron at the road, Tyrese coming into the prison, Rosita, Eugene, Magna's group, Connie, the people in the Commonwealth. Daryl would come down on the side of trust, and pretty much every time he was correct. He has this very particular way of looking at someone, sort of squinting at them across a room while pretending to be doing something else, that I think is meant to communicate that he's making up his mind. The thing is, you watch the show and you start to realise that by the time Daryl is doing the squint, he's already made up his mind. The squint is just confirmation, a small thing I love. There's an episode in the prison where Carol is teaching the kids to use knives in secret, and Carl asks his dad not to stop her because he thinks she's right. Daryl is just sort of around in the background of the prison era, but you can tell he agreed with Carol. He never weighed in on it openly. He just kept showing up to back her play whenever she needed it. That's a very Daryl thing, the alliance you don't have to announce. Personal opinion, and you can take this or leave it. Daryl is the character whose presence I find most comforting on a rewatch. The show, depending on the season, can be very stressful. Lots of shouting, lots of impossible decisions, lots of monologues delivered by characters about to do something they will regret. Daryl is sort of the still point in the middle of all of it. He's almost always doing the right thing, almost always doing it without saying anything about it, and almost always being correct about who to stand next to. There's something about that quietness that I think is genuinely rare. Most characters in long-running television are written to be wrong, sometimes, on purpose, to create plot. Daryl mostly isn't. The plot has to find ways to work around him, because if you let him decide, he generally decides correctly, and that doesn't leave a lot of room for drama. He doesn't get a big vindication scene. Daryl's never been a vindication scene kind of character. What he gets instead is the show ending with him being one of the last people standing, riding away into a future the audience doesn't fully see, going to find the people he cares about. That's about as Daryl as endings get. No speech, no revelation, just the right person doing the right thing, going where he was going to go anyway. Hey, dumbass, that's how Glenn enters the show. Rick is in the tank in Atlanta, pinned in by walkers, no plan, no idea what to do. The radio crackles. A voice on the other end asks if he's the dumbass in the tank. Rick says he is. Glenn talks him out of the tank, through an alley, up a fire escape, onto a roof, and into the rest of his life. That moment is a fairly small entrance for a character who would end up being one of the most important people on the entire show, and I think it's quietly one of the better introductions the show ever wrote. Glenn shows up already being right about something. Rick was about to die. Glenn knew the route. Glenn knew the timings. Glenn knew the buildings. From that very first scene, Glenn was the guy who would tell you the correct thing to do, and you would either listen and survive, or you wouldn't, and you'd be in trouble. He'd been a pizza delivery guy in Atlanta before the world ended. The show makes a slightly underrated joke about this. The apocalypse, of all things, finally rewarded the person who knew the city's back alleys better than anyone else. Glenn ran supply runs for the Atlanta camp because he was the only one who could go in and out without dying. He knew which streets the walkers had drifted to. He knew which storefronts still had stock. He'd done this for hours a day, in a uniform, for tips, for years. The world fell apart, and the most useful person in the entire camp turned out to be the kid who used to do the deliveries. His judgment of people was the other thing he was almost always right about. He met Maggie and committed within a few episodes. He didn't dither. He didn't second guess. He decided very early that this person was worth standing with, and he stood with her, and the rest of his life on the show was in some way a series of follow-throughs on that one decision. He read Herschel correctly, even when Herschel was being grumpy with him. He read Rick correctly when most of the group was starting to lose patience with him. He read Daryl correctly when most of the group still saw Daryl as Merle's slightly less terrible brother. He had this quiet eye for who people actually were, underneath what they were pretending to be at the moment, and he kept being correct about it. The one big judgment call I want to talk about, the one that I think is most painful, is Nicholas in Alexandria. Nicholas was the man who ran. There was a run gone wrong outside the walls. People got attacked. Nicholas panicked, and he ran. And he ran through a revolving door, and he left Noah trapped on the other side. And Noah was torn apart in front of Glenn, while Glenn was screaming on the wrong side of the glass. That is one of the most genuinely upsetting scenes the show ever did. It is the kind of scene that would, in most television, set up the death of the man who caused it. Glenn was right there. Glenn watched it happen. The narrative momentum in that moment was firmly in the direction of Glenn putting Nicholas down. Glenn didn't. He let Nicholas live. He brought him back to Alexandria. He made a decision in the moment that he was not going to be the kind of person who became a murderer because of someone else's mistake. Now here's the thing. Nicholas, much later, in the next season, on top of a dumpster surrounded by walkers, having one final crack at being a coward, killed himself, and his body fell on top of Glenn, and the walkers swarmed in, and the whole audience for several episodes thought Glenn was dead. He wasn't that time. He turned up under the dumpster in a moment of cheating that the fandom never quite forgave the show for. But the seed had been planted. Nicholas's cowardice cost Glenn a tremendous amount, in stress and in goodwill from the audience, and the question of whether Glenn had been right to spare him is one the show keeps quietly asking. I think he was right. I want to be honest about that. The cost of being right was high. The principle was sound. There was a version of Glenn who put Nicholas down in that revolving door scene, and that version of Glenn would have been a different person for the rest of the show. He would have lost something specific. The thing he was trying to protect by sparing Nicholas was not just Nicholas. It was the version of himself that could still come home to Maggie and not feel like he had to wash something off in the shower first. The show never quite gives him credit for it. The death scene, when Negan finally swings Lucille at his head in the lineup, is the show's payoff for everything Glenn had been. It's a brutal scene. It's the most upsetting moment in the entire show for a lot of viewers, and it's still, 10 years later, the most discussed death in any of the spin-offs. Glenn's last line is to Maggie, telling her he'll find her. That was the version of him the show had been building for 6 seasons. The pizza guy who, against all the odds, had become a husband, a future father, a leader. That was the man Negan killed. Personal opinion. Glenn's loss is the one that changes the entire shape of the show. I don't think this is controversial. The fandom argued about it at the time, but I think most people who have rewatched the run would agree with me. After Glenn dies, the show changes register. The moral compass that had been quietly steering things from somewhere inside the group is suddenly gone, and the people left over have to figure out, on their own, who is going to do that work. They mostly don't. Maggie tries in her grief. Aaron tries in his quiet way. Father Gabriel grows into it slowly, but the specific kind of compass Glenn had been, observational, generous, instinctive, was gone. And the show kept being good for a while afterwards, but it was a different show. The fact that the entire post-Glenn arc of the show is essentially Maggie carrying his absence around with her, all the way through to her son being born, all the way through Hilltop, all the way through Manhattan with Negan in the spin-off, is itself a kind of long, slow vindication of who Glenn had been. The man was so loved, so genuinely valuable, that his absence holds together as a story for the next 4 or 5 seasons of television. Herschel Jr., the kid who never knew his father, is one of the most quietly weighty characters in the late show seasons, because he's a walking reminder of what was taken. And here is the small thing I find most touching, and I'll wrap up Glenn on this. There's a moment in Dead City, the Maggie and Negan show, where Maggie talks about Glenn. Just briefly, just a few sentences, and the way she talks about him, all those years later, is still in the present tense for her in a particular way. Glenn was the kind of person who keeps being a presence in the lives of people who loved him, even after he's gone. That's a hard thing to write into a fictional character. The show managed it, mostly because Stephen Yeun was enormously good in the role, but also because the writing kept Glenn the right kind of correct. He kept being the person you wanted in the room. The room never quite got over him leaving it. Carol's whole arc is a study in being right, and being punished for it anyway. I want to start there because I think it's the cleanest way to talk about her. She kept making correct calls, often hard ones, and the show kept finding ways to make her pay for it, until eventually she'd paid so much that she couldn't keep being the person who paid for it any longer, and she had to walk away from it for a while. Quick refresher on where she started, because it matters. Carol first appears in season 1 as a battered, frightened housewife with a husband called Ed, who hit her, and a daughter called Sophia, who didn't survive the search at the farm. She had been told, basically, her entire adult life, that she was small and breakable and stupid, and the early seasons of the show find her trying to figure out what's left of her once she doesn't have to be those things anymore. By season 4, she had figured it out. And what she had figured out was that she could do, very calmly, the things that other people in the group could not bring themselves to do. Karen and David. This is the one. The flu was spreading through the prison. 2 patients had it, in a way that looked like it was going to kill them and probably take half the prison with them. Carol made a decision. She killed them both, dragged their bodies outside, and burned them. Tyrese, who'd been quietly courting Karen, found their charred bodies the next morning. The whole season pivots on the question of who did it. Carol eventually told Rick. Rick, who had been trying to be a peaceful Herschel-style farmer at the time, exiled her from the group. So was she right? The show is honest enough to never quite say. The flu came back. The methodology was brutal. But here's what I keep coming back to. The flu killed a lot of people in the prison. It killed people on antibiotics. It killed people in isolation. The thing Carol was trying to prevent was a slower, larger version of what eventually happened anyway. Her instinct that you sometimes have to do something unforgivable to keep something more unforgivable from happening to everyone else kept being correct in different forms for the rest of the show, and the show kept handing her situations where it was the only option on the table. Lizzie is the next one. Lizzie was one of the kids who came into the prison group in season 4. She was, to put it gently, not okay. She thought the walkers were her friends. She would feed them rats. She would talk to them as if they were children. And eventually, when the prison fell and Carol was looking after Lizzie and her younger sister Mika out on the road, Lizzie killed Mika to prove that Mika could come back as a walker and still be the same person. The episode that contains the resolution of that storyline is one of the bleakest hours of television I have ever watched. And I want to be clear that I'm not going to walk through it in detail because I don't think a sleep video is the place for it. Carol, at the end of that episode, took Lizzie out into a field of flowers, told her to look at them, and shot her in the back of the head. Tyrese, who had a much bigger and slower heart, would not have done it. Tyrese would have tried to fix Lizzie, and Lizzie would have killed somebody else, probably a child, before he had time to finish trying. Carol's read on Lizzie was correct. The cost of being correct was enormous. The cost of being wrong would have been worse. Then there's the smaller stuff that I think proves the pattern. Teaching the kids at the prison to use knives. Carol set up a children's story time in the library, and instead of reading them stories, she started teaching them how to defend themselves. The council had asked her not to. Rick had said no. Carol did it anyway. It was the right call. The governor's tank arrived at the prison fences a few episodes later, and a lot of those kids had to use what she had taught them. Some of them survived because of it. The kids who had been kept innocent of how to defend themselves did not mostly. Terminus is the bit where I genuinely believe she went somewhere most of the other characters could not follow. The group was being held in a railroad car. They were going to be slaughtered for meat, in essence. Carol walked up to the compound on her own, smeared herself with walker guts to mask her scent, blew up a propane tank to start a herd stampede, walked into Terminus during the chaos, found Rick, and got everyone out. Rick saw her on the road afterwards and dropped to his knees. He had nothing to say. There was nothing to say. The woman they had exiled for being too willing to make hard calls had just saved their lives by being more willing to make hard calls than any of them had been. The Saviour's compound at the start of Season 6 is another one. The group went in at night, did the job, came out. Carol shot Paula in the face after Paula tried to lunge at her. She set fire to a room full of armed men who had walked into a trap. She came home and cried about it, and started counting the people she had killed. 18, 20, whatever the number was. She started writing them down. And here's where I find Carol's arc most honest, the cottage period. She moved out of Alexandria, eventually, and went and lived in a small house on her own. She picked up a rosary. She took up smoking on the porch. She tried, in her quiet way, to step back from being the person who did the worst job in the group. Ezekiel found her there, brought her cobbler, sat with her, and slowly drew her back out into the world. That arc, Carol stepping back from violence because the cost of being right kept getting heavier, is one of the most genuinely truthful pieces of writing on the show. She wasn't wrong before. She just couldn't keep being right about that kind of thing forever without losing herself completely. There's a limit to how many times you can be the person who does the unspeakable thing, and Carol had hit it. The show, to its credit, let her notice and let her step back. What's interesting is that she kept getting pulled back in. Henry, the boy she and Ezekiel adopted, gets killed by Alpha. The grief sends Carol on a long dark detour through the Whisperer War. She gets reckless. She makes some calls she shouldn't have. She nearly buries Connie and Magna in a cave system. She pushes Negan into killing Alpha herself. She walks around Alexandria for half a season, being haunted by a ghost version of Alpha, taunting her with her own guilt. The show treats this as Carol losing her grip. I think a more accurate read is that the show was finally letting her have a full grief response after about 10 years of needing her to be functional. Personal opinion, and you might disagree, but Carol is the character whose journey I find hardest to look away from on rewatch. Every time the show let her stop being the person who did the terrible job, she got pulled back into it because she was the one who could. Other people in the group could have done it, in theory. In practice, when the moment came, it was always Carol. Rick would hesitate, Daryl would hesitate, Tyrese definitely would hesitate. Carol, when she had decided what needed doing, would do it, and then she would carry it. The show's last seasons let her become a kind of grandmother figure to a few different communities. She works in the kitchen at the Commonwealth. She helps run things at Alexandria. The spin-off with Daryl in France finally gives her the chance to go and find him after she's been alone for too long, and the show is wise enough to let that be a quiet reunion rather than a dramatic one. They sit, they talk, they get on with it. After everything she's been through, she gets to be in a kitchen with the closest friend she ever had, and that's about as much vindication as the show is willing to hand her. That feels right to me. Carol was never going to get a big public moment of, she was correct all along. Her being right was always too uncomfortable to celebrate. The most the show could do was let her live to see her old friends again, and let her hold a cup of tea, and let her have a quiet evening for once. Honestly, that might be more than the show could afford to give most of its characters. Carol earned it about 4 times over. I have a lot of affection for Eugene Porter, and I want to put that on the table at the start, because Eugene is one of those characters who on paper should not work. He's a coward. He's an enormous liar. He's preposterously dressed with the mullets and the cargo shorts and the polo shirt, like he wandered in from a stock photo of a man at a barbecue. And yet, by the end of the show, he was probably the most genuinely transformed person in the entire cast. Not the strongest, not the bravest, the most transformed. Quick recap, in case it's been a while. Eugene shows up in the back half of Season 4 with Abraham and Rosita. The pitch is that Eugene is a scientist. He has the cure for the apocalypse in his head. They're trying to get him to Washington, D.C., where there are research facilities and presumably some kind of remaining government, and once he gets there, he can save everyone. It is, of course, a complete lie. Eugene is not a scientist. He has no cure. He's a smart guy who knows how to talk like a smart guy, and he's been using that ability to stay alive in a world that does not generally reward a smart people without other useful skills. Abraham was the muscle. Rosita was the brains in their own right. Eugene was, basically, a hostage Abraham had agreed to escort in exchange for the promise of a future that did not exist. The fire truck scene is the moment that I think starts the whole second half of his arc, and it is, for me, one of the genuinely best confessions in the show. They're stuck on a road with a herd ahead of them and a herd behind them. Abraham wants to push through. Eugene loses his nerve, and instead of running, he tells the truth, loudly. He shouts it. "I'm not a scientist." And then, because he's Eugene, he keeps talking. He lists by name every person who has died trying to deliver him to DC. He recites them as a kind of confession. Stephanie, Warren, Pam, Rex, Roger, Josiah, Dirk, Josephine, Bob. He'd been keeping count. He hadn't been able to stop himself from keeping count, even while he was lying. Abraham punches him in the face, twice, slams his head into the windshield wiper, walks away, falls to his knees on the road, and weeps. The whole truck of them is just sort of standing there, recalibrating their entire lives, while Eugene is bleeding into the asphalt. Now, the thing that is interesting to me about that scene, and that I think is the genuine pivot of his character, is that Eugene came out of that confession not as a man who'd been broken, but as a man who had been freed. He had been carrying that lie for so long, performing the role of the scientist with such constant attention, that the lie had become heavier than he was. Once he set it down, he could finally start being useful in the way he was actually useful, which is that he was a smart guy who could solve problems if you put a problem in front of him. And he did. The first thing he did, basically, after the confession, was figure out how to make ammunition. The group needed bullets. Eugene could read manuals. Eugene could understand chemistry. Eugene could set up a small-scale ammunition factory. He turned out to be exactly the kind of useful person he had been pretending to be, just with a different kind of usefulness. Not the cure for the apocalypse, just the means to keep his friends armed for the foreseeable future. The Saviour's arc is where his being right gets complicated, and I want to handle this with some care, because the show itself is deliberately ambiguous about it. Eugene gets kidnapped by Negan after the lineup. He's brought to the sanctuary. He's nicknamed Dr. Smarty Pants. He starts producing useful work for Negan, including the iron shell coating idea for the fence walkers, which is genuinely clever from a defensive standpoint. He plays along. He makes friends with Negan's wives. He starts to seem from the outside like he might have flipped. There's a scene where Rosita and Sasha are watching the sanctuary outpost from a distance, and they decide that the right move is to take Eugene out. He's helping the enemy. He's complicit. They're going to go in and kill him. What was Eugene actually doing? The show is honest enough to let you wonder. I think the most generous reading, and I think the correct reading, is that Eugene was applying his own form of survival ethics. He had spent his entire adult life surviving by pretending to be useful to whoever had power over him. He did the same thing with Negan. The plan was to live first, sort the moral arithmetic out later, when he had time. That is not a heroic plan. It is also probably the only plan that was actually going to keep him alive. When the group eventually broke into the sanctuary, Eugene was helping. He had been helping. He was making bullets that didn't work. He was passing notes. He was, in his own quiet, lying, mullet-having way, fighting. He just wasn't doing it loudly. The Stephanie arc and the Commonwealth arc are where I think his whole character finally pays off. Eugene starts talking on the radio. He finds a woman on the other end. They talk for weeks. He develops an actual relationship, the first one of his life, with somebody who has no reason to know what he looks like or who he used to be. He gets to be the new version of himself with her. And eventually, he convinces the group to take a long trip to find her, and they end up at the Commonwealth. At the Commonwealth, Eugene has to confess to his lies all over again. He lies to Stephanie at first about being from a big settlement. He lies to her about who he is. And then, in another interrogation scene with Mercer, he confesses everything. He tells the truth about the radio. He tells the truth about being scared. He tells the truth about being a virgin, which is the kind of detail you only confess to a stranger if you have absolutely run out of pretending. He had spent his life building a fortified version of himself, and he finally took the walls down and let somebody see him. There's a courtroom scene later in the Commonwealth arc where Eugene has to testify about killing Sebastian Milton. It happened more or less by accident, in a moment of panic. Eugene tells the court the truth. He doesn't dress it up. He doesn't try to lawyer his way out of it. He says what happened, plainly. The whole arc from Houston fire truck coward to a man who could stand up in a courtroom and tell the truth is one of the most genuine character journeys the show pulled off. And I don't think the show gets enough credit for it. Personal aside, since I get to have one, I find Eugene moving in a way that I don't quite have language for. Most characters in TWD are wrong because they trust the wrong person, or they make the wrong tactical call, or they panic at the wrong moment. Eugene was wrong because he was scared and he wanted to live. That's the most human kind of wrong there is, and the show was generous enough to let him slowly grow out of it without ever pretending the cost had been small. People had died for his lies. He'd carried the names. He grew into the kind of person who could carry the names without having to lie about why anymore. He ends the show with a wife and a baby and a job, sitting at a desk in the Commonwealth, helping put together a community that is actually going to last. That is, by some distance, the most ordinary ending of any character in the entire run. And I think that's exactly correct. After everything he had been, after everything he had done, the right ending for Eugene Porter was an ordinary one. He had earned it. I think Maggie deserves a lot of credit, more than she generally gets, for refusing to forgive Negan. The show kept asking her to. The other characters kept asking her to. There were entire seasons that operated on the unspoken assumption that eventually she would have to. Forgiveness was the arc. Reconciliation was the destination. The whole apparatus of late show storytelling kept gently nudging her towards sitting down with the man who had killed her husband and saying, "All right, let's try this." She refused, for years. And when she did finally sit down with him, in Manhattan, in the Dead City spin-off, it was not forgiveness. It was a working arrangement. She needed his help. She did not need to absolve him. The show, finally, after a lot of pressure on her character, let her keep that line. I want to walk through her arc backwards a bit, because I think Maggie is best understood through the question of what she carried. Lineup night, Season 7 premiere. Most of the people listening to this will already know what happened in the dirt that night, but for the few who don't, I won't dwell on it. Glenn's death in front of his pregnant wife, with a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, is the kind of thing that defines a character, whether they want it to or not. Maggie was on her knees in the dirt. She was sick from the pregnancy. She watched it happen, and she came out of that night with a clarity nobody else in the group quite had. The rest of the group spent the next half season working out what they were going to do about Negan. There was a lot of moping. There was a lot of, are we going to fight back, are we not? Maggie didn't have that question. Maggie understood, from the moment the bat came down, what Negan was, and she understood that the only way out was through. She didn't need it explained to her. She didn't need to be talked into the war. By the time Rick came around to the position she had already been holding, the position had been occupied and furnished for several weeks. Hilltop, the year she spent running it, is the part of her arc that I think tends to get overlooked. She walked into a community where the leadership was a smarmy weasel called Gregory, and she gradually replaced him by being better at the job than he was. She didn't stage a coup, she didn't make a speech, she just kept being the person who actually knew what to do when something went wrong. And Gregory kept being the person who didn't, and after a while, everyone in Hilltop had quietly transferred their loyalty to her. She was a leader who had grown into the role through nothing but competence and the absence of any other competent option. I find that one of the more believable leadership arcs the show ever did. There was no big moment of her being chosen. There was no battle she won that proved she was the queen. She just took on the work, did it well for a long stretch of time, and one day the community noticed that she was the one in charge. Now, the long absence, Lauren Cohan left the show for a stretch in the middle, for production reasons. The character was written off screen. The way the show explains it, in the canon, is that Maggie took her son and left the community because she could not stand to be around what Negan's slow rehabilitation was asking her to accept. She couldn't watch him sit at the same tables as her family. She couldn't watch Rick and the others tolerate his presence. She couldn't be there for the gradual reintegration of a man she still wanted dead. And she made the call that the right thing for her son was to be raised somewhere else, with people who had not made that compromise. I think she was right. The show eventually came around to admitting it. By the time she returned, her instinct that Negan's redemption was being handled in a way that did not honour Glenn's memory had been quietly vindicated by, frankly, the show itself. The Whisperer War had happened. Negan had killed Alpha. He had been let out of the cell. He had been allowed to wander Alexandria. The show had made a series of choices that asked the audience to gradually accept him as part of the family, and the only character who'd refused to do that was Maggie, off-screen, raising her boy elsewhere. She came back to a community that had moved on without her, and she did not pretend to be okay with how it had moved on. The conversation she eventually has with Negan after her return, and the show takes its time getting them to actually sit in a room together, is one of the more honest scenes the show ever produced about forgiveness. Negan apologizes. Maggie does not accept the apology. She does not refuse it dramatically either. She just does not accept it. She tells him very calmly that she does not have to forgive him for him to be useful, and that she is not going to forgive him to make him feel better. She is not interested in making him feel better. He is going to have to live with what he did, and she is going to have to live with what he did. And those are two separate burdens, and they're not going to be reconciled. That's a more grown-up handling of forgiveness than fiction usually attempts. Fiction loves a hug-it-out scene. Maggie refuses to give the show that scene. The show, in fairness, eventually stops asking her for it. Dead City. The Manhattan Arc. This is the bit where Maggie and Negan, the two of them, with their actual son and adopted son situation off in the background, end up working together in a flooded ruin of New York to deal with a man called the Croat, who is one of Negan's old people from the Savior's days. It's a strange show. Manhattan as a location is fantastic. The towers, the bridges, the bizarre way nature has reclaimed the city, and Maggie and Negan as a partnership are both more compelling and more uncomfortable than the original show was ever willing to make them. What Dead City does well, and what I think proves Maggie was right all along about how to handle Negan, is that it lets her use him without trusting him. She gives him jobs. She watches him. She does not let him into her family in any meaningful way. Herschel Jr. is not going to grow up thinking of Negan as a friend. The arrangement is professional, in a way that fits the post-apocalypse perfectly. You can work with someone you do not forgive. You can use someone's skills without telling them you've changed your mind about them. Personal opinion, there is a specific kind of grief in Maggie that I think the show handled better than almost anything else it attempted. She lost Glenn. She did not move on. She built her son and her community and her life on top of that grief, but she didn't pretend the grief had gone away. That's a more accurate picture of how loss actually works than most fiction lets itself attempt. Most fiction wants the bereaved to either be destroyed by the loss or to recover from the loss. Maggie did neither. She carried it, and the carrying was visible in her body and in the way she spoke, and the show was patient enough to let that be the texture of the character for years. There's a moment in Dead City, and I'll wrap up Maggie on this, where she's talking about Glenn to somebody who barely knew him. It's a small scene. She doesn't make a speech. She talks about him in the present tense in a particular way. He had been gone for years at that point in the timeline, but the way she talked about him, you could tell he was still, in some sense, the person she was building everything around. The son, the community, the arrangement with Negan. All of it, in some quiet way, was about Glenn. She had been right about him in the very beginning, when she had decided to commit to him. She kept being right about him, in the long aftermath of his loss, by refusing to stop loving him just because he wasn't there to love back. The first time we meet Aaron, he's standing in the middle of a road with a friendly smile and a stupid haircut, asking if he can have a word. Rick punches him in the face. That's the welcome. The man came up with kind eyes and an offer of community, and Rick punched him in the face and tied him to a chair. I think about that scene a lot because Aaron didn't really hold it against him. He knew what he was walking into. He had spent enough time watching strangers from a distance to understand that whoever Rick's group had become out on the road, they were not going to react well to a clean-shaven man with a clipboard offering them somewhere to live. He had factored the punch into his expectations. He had probably packed an ice pack. What Aaron's actual job at Alexandria was in the early days was scout and recruiter. He went out into the world, watched people from a distance, decided who was worth bringing in. The show makes a point of how careful he was about it. He wasn't looking for the strongest. He wasn't looking for the most heavily armed. He was looking for people who behaved a certain way when they thought nobody was watching. People who shared. People who buried the dead. People who would help a stranger without expecting payment. He had basically a set of moral tells that he used to assess strangers, and the system was actually quite good. He picked Rick's group. Almost everyone else in Alexandria thought it was a mistake. Deanna had her doubts. The guards at the gate had their doubts. Aaron just looked at this hardened, exhausted, dangerous-looking pack of survivors and said, basically, these are the ones. They're worth the risk, and he was right. Rick's group ended up being the thing that allowed Alexandria to survive everything that came at it after. The thing that I find quietly impressive about Aaron is that the position he held, careful, generous optimism about people, is actually really difficult to hold in the post-apocalypse, and the show does not pretend otherwise. He wasn't naive. He'd seen what people did to each other. He'd watched bad recruits go bad. He'd lost partners in the field. There's a whole arc with a man called Davidson, who Aaron thought was a good recruit, and who turned out to be a monster. And the show uses that to demonstrate that Aaron's process was not infallible. He was a careful optimist, not a stupid one. And the difference between those two things is, I think, exactly the thing the show wanted Aaron to embody. His relationship with Eric was one of the warmest things on the show, and I want to take a moment with it because I think the way the show handled it was actually quite graceful. They were a couple, they lived together in a house in Alexandria, they had lives and friends and disagreements, and the show treated all of that with a casualness that I appreciated. Aaron and Eric weren't the gay couple. They were just Aaron and Eric. The show let them be specific to themselves rather than representative of anything. There's a small detail I love. Aaron was the cook, Eric was the better dressed one. They bickered about the spaghetti recipe. Eric's death in the Saviour's War is one of the quietly devastating moments in the show. He gets shot in a firefight. He's bleeding out. Aaron carries him to a tree, sits with him, holds his hand. Eric tells Aaron very plainly that he has to go and finish the fight. Aaron does. He goes back into the battle. He comes back later, and Eric is already a walker, and Aaron has to watch him stagger off into a herd. He does not put him down. He cannot bring himself to do it. He just watches Eric go. That sequence is one of the truest depictions of grief in the show, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Aaron loses his partner, and continues to fight in the war anyway, because Eric had asked him to. The next several episodes you can see Aaron carrying that loss around, and the show is patient about it. He does not have a breakdown, he does not deliver a speech, he just looks tired in a way that he had not looked tired before. The injury came later. Aaron lost his arm helping survivors in the chaos of one of the wars. There was an iron gate, his arm got pinned, he had to be cut free, the limb was beyond saving. He kept being useful afterwards. He learned to fight with a prosthetic that had a mace fitted to it. He kept recruiting. He raised Gracie, the baby daughter he had found, in the carnage of a saviour outpost, like she was his own. Gracie is a detail I find genuinely moving. Aaron had killed her father in a firefight. He found her in a baby seat in the next room. He had no obligation to her, in any practical or moral sense. Her father had been saviour-aligned. The situation was a mess. The easier thing would have been to hand her off to someone else. Aaron didn't. He took her home. He raised her. She turned out, in the later seasons, to be a small, capable, brave little kid, and Aaron is the reason for that. He had been right that this was a person worth saving, even when the world had given him every reason not to bother. The Whisperer's years showed his read on threats was as accurate as his read on individuals. He understood very early that Alpha was not a normal opponent. The Whisperer mask trick, wearing the skin of the dead to walk among them, broke a few rules of how people had been operating up to that point, and Aaron, who had watched a lot of strangers in his time, understood faster than most that the Whisperers were going to require a different set of responses. He didn't underestimate them. He didn't oversell them. He just registered them accurately and kept doing his work. He was also right about Magna's group, the wandering survivors who were brought into the hilltop. He vouched for them when others were skeptical. He turned out to be correct. He was right about Lydia, Alpha's daughter, who was raised among the Whisperers and was taken in by the coalition. He recognized that she was a frightened girl with a complicated upbringing, not a spy. He kept being the person who could look at a stranger in a difficult situation and accurately calibrate how much of a risk they actually represented. Personal opinion? There's a kind of optimism Aaron has that I find genuinely rare in fiction, and I want to be specific about why. It's not the cheerful kind. It's not the bright-eyed, naive kind. It's the kind of optimism that's been earned by walking through things that would justifiably have made you cynical, and choosing not to be cynical anyway. He had buried a partner. He had killed a child's father. He had lost an arm. He had watched a community survive on the back of his recruitment work, and he had also watched a few of his recruits go bad. None of that turned him into the kind of person who closes the gates and refuses to open them. He kept opening them carefully, and he kept being correct about most of the people he opened them for. There's a small thing that I think captures Aaron, and I'll wrap up his section on this. In one of the later seasons, when the Commonwealth situation was unravelling, Aaron got pulled out of a hole, beaten, left for dead, and he eventually got back up and walked back to his community. He didn't make a vengeance arc out of it. He didn't go after the people who had done it. He just got home, hugged Gracie, and got back to work. That's the kind of recovery the show didn't always give its characters, and it suited him. Aaron, more than most, knew that the best thing he could do with his life was keep doing the thing he was good at. So he did. I want to talk about Negan in a particular way, and I want to be honest about what I'm doing, because Negan being right about a few things is not a defense of who he was. He killed Glenn. He killed Abraham. He ran a fiefdom that ground people down for years. He is, in any reasonable accounting, the closest thing the original show has to a clear villain, and I am not interested in trying to clean that up. That said, and this is the bit I find genuinely interesting about him as a character, the show is honest enough to put him in situations where his read of things is the correct one. And I think those moments are worth talking about, because they complicate the picture in a way that most television does not bother to attempt. The first thing he was right about, and I think this is the most uncomfortable one for the audience to sit with, is what Rick's group had done in the time leading up to the lineup The Saviours had picked a fight with Rick's people. Fair enough, but Rick's people had then gone into the satellite outpost in the middle of the night and slaughtered a group of sleeping Saviours. They had stabbed people in their beds. They had made it as bloody as they could. The justification in their heads was that the Saviours were going to do worse to them eventually, so they were taking the initiative. Whatever you think of the justification, the action was what it was. They had killed sleeping men in their beds. When Negan turns up to the lineup and gives his "You killed my men" speech, monstrous in its delivery, and in what comes next, the content of the accusation is just true. They had killed his men. The show has to do a fair amount of work, in the seasons that follow, to keep Rick's group as the protagonists of that war and not the aggressors, and the way the show does that work is mostly by escalating Negan's behaviour past anything Rick's group had done. But the original count, the one that started it, was Rick's people doing something genuinely horrible in the dark, with their own moral cushioning fully intact. Negan's first move, the bat in the dirt, was retribution. The math of it doesn't make either side morally clean. The Whisperer's arc is where I think his being right gets the most interesting. Negan, by that point, has been a prisoner of Alexandria for years. He's been kept in a cell. He's been let out occasionally to garden tomatoes and to be talked at by Father Gabriel. And he eventually gets out, gets recaptured, gets out again, and ends up infiltrating Alpha's camp. What Negan brings to that situation is something nobody else in the Coalition could bring. He understands tyrants. He understands them from the inside. He spent years running a tyranny of his own. So when he meets Alpha, and the show has fun with the chemistry between them, in a way I find genuinely odd to watch, Negan is not impressed by her in the way some of her followers are. He sees the act underneath the philosophy. He clocks her vulnerabilities. He understands, almost immediately, that she is not actually as committed to her own ideology as she claims to be, and that the right kind of pressure could break her. Carol pushes him to kill Alpha. He goes along with it, partly because he wants out of the cell long term, partly because he agrees with the read. He gets the job done with a knife and a kiss and a moment of something like genuine connection before he cuts her throat. The show frames this as a redemption arc beat, and I think that's a slightly self-serving reading. What it actually was, in pure terms, was Negan being correct about a strategic situation. Alpha could not be reasoned with. The war was not going to end any other way. The path to peace, such as it was going to be, ran through her death. Carol knew that. Negan knew that. The Coalition leadership had been hesitant about it. Negan and Carol got it done. Partly out of vengeance, partly out of grief, but mostly because it was the read of the situation that turned out to be accurate. He was also right, I think, about Maggie's distrust of him being legitimate. This is the thing I find most quietly impressive about Late Show Negan. He does not try to convince Maggie she should forgive him. He does not stage a big, tearful apology and demand reconciliation. He understands why she can't forgive him. He understands what he did. The self-awareness is the thing that makes the late season Negan complicated rather than just rehabilitated. A man who has done what he did and who has come out of it understanding precisely why he doesn't get to be friends with the family of the person he killed is in a stranger moral position than fiction usually attempts. Dead City, the Manhattan spin-off, leans into all of this. Negan in Manhattan is reading rooms, working with limited information, navigating a city that has been chewed up and reclaimed by water and rust. He uses his survival instincts pretty well for a man who is 20 years older than when he was at his peak. He is sometimes wrong, sometimes right. His instincts about the Croat being a worse problem than himself, that one is correct. The Croat is one of his old people from the Saviour's days, a man who has used Negan's tactics and ideology to build a small empire of his own in a different city. And Negan recognizes him for exactly what he is, partly because the Croat is what Negan would have become if he had not been incarcerated for a decade and had to actually sit with what he had done. The relationship with Lydia is another one I want to mention briefly. Lydia is Alpha's daughter, raised by the Whisperers, broken in a number of specific ways. Negan, for reasons that are partly self-interested and partly not, takes her under his wing. He's protective of her. He gives her advice. He tells her more than once not to grow up to be like either of her parents, including him. The kindness is unexpected. It's also genuine. Whatever else Negan was, in his late show iteration, he was capable of looking at a damaged kid and not making her more damaged, which is a low bar, but one that a lot of characters in the show consistently fail to clear. Personal note, and I'll keep this one careful, I find Negan one of the harder characters in the show to talk about cleanly. The show doesn't quite know what it wants to say about him. Sometimes I think that's a flaw. Sometimes I think it's actually the most honest thing the show could do with a character like him. People who have done monstrous things sometimes have accurate reads of situations. That doesn't redeem the monstrous things. It just complicates the moral picture in a way fiction usually does not have the patience for. The thing that the show, to its credit, never quite does is fully redeem him. He doesn't get a hug-it-out scene with Maggie. He doesn't get to die heroically in someone's arms. He doesn't get the standard arc that long-running TV gives to bad guys it has fallen in love with. He keeps having to live with what he did. He keeps having to do useful things for people who do not really like him. He keeps running into rooms where he is not welcome. The show keeps holding him at arm's length, even as it gives him more screen time than any of his victims. And I think that's the closest thing to honest accounting fiction can really pull off with a character like that. He was right about a few things. He was wrong about the most important things. Both of those things sit in the same person, and the show eventually lets you make of him what you will. That is genuinely more nuanced than I expected from a network television drama about zombies, and I think Negan is, weirdly, the place the show was bravest about its own moral ambiguity. He is not a hero. He is not a clean villain. He is, in the late seasons, a useful, dangerous, lonely man, living in a world that does not really have a place for him. And he keeps making himself useful anyway, and the people around him keep tolerating him, and that is a whole story unto itself. Carl Grimes was a kid for most of his time on this show. That's the bit I keep coming back to when I think about him. He was a kid through 8 seasons of television, and the show made the very strange decision to kill him before he ever quite became the adult he was clearly going to be. The decision is one that has been argued about for years, and I've changed my mind on it a few times. But the thing I want to talk about here is not the decision to kill him. It's what he had become before they killed him, and what he had been right about all along. Early Carl is a problem. I am not going to pretend otherwise. There was a stretch of the early seasons where Carl ran into the woods at the worst possible moment, picked up a gun he shouldn't have, gave a smug answer to a parent, or wandered off after a deer in the middle of an emergency. The fandom developed a whole running joke about staying in the house. It was not unfair. Carl, in the very early going, was a kid making kid decisions in a world that had absolutely no patience for them, and the show was honest enough to keep showing the consequences. But the shift happened gradually, and I think it happened earlier than people give the show credit for. The prison years started to settle him. The loss of his mother in the prison, in one of the most upsetting sequences the show ever did something to him that the show was patient about. He came out the other side quieter, harder, but also weirdly more thoughtful. He'd seen the worst thing he was ever going to see, and he had survived it, and after that he was a different kind of presence in the group. By the time you get to the back half of season 7, Carl is a person you should be listening to. He has lost an eye. He has been in real fights. He has read a lot of books that nobody else in the group has time for. He has watched his dad become someone harder than the man who left Atlanta, and he has noticed the change, and he has formed opinions about what the change is costing. The Negan on the porch scene is the one I want to spend a moment with, because it is one of the strangest, best small scenes the show ever did. Negan, the man who killed Glenn, the man who's been running roughshod over Alexandria for a season, ends up sitting on Rick's porch with Carl. They drink lemonade, they talk. Negan asks Carl about his eye. Carl shows him. The whole sequence is filmed with this very weird, soft, intimate camera language that the show did not usually use for Negan scenes. And the effect is that you watch this kid, who could plausibly hate this man more than anyone alive should hate anyone, sitting with him and just talking to him. That scene is where you start to see Carl's actual gift. He could see past the immediate hatred to the larger question. He understood, even in that moment, that Negan was a man, not a monster, that the war his father was about to fight was going to take a cost from everyone who fought it, and that the cost was going to be paid for years afterwards by people who hadn't started it. The letters are the thing I want to land Carl on because they are, essentially, the philosophical pivot of the entire show. When Carl knew he was dying, bitten on a run, hidden the wound, finally told his father, he wrote letters. He wrote one to Rick. He wrote one to Negan. He wrote one to Judith, his sister. The letter to Rick is the one that the show keeps returning to. Carl tells him, in about as plain language as he can, that the war is not worth winning if it breaks the person Rick used to be. He tells him that the future he wants does not look like more of this. He asks Rick to find a way out. He asks Rick to make peace. Rick reads that letter. Rick, who has just spent half a season committing fully to the war, who has been on the verge of becoming a person who lives only for victory, reads what his dying son has asked him to do, and he changes course. The end of the Saviour's War, the moment Rick stops the killing, the moment he refuses to let Maggie execute Negan in the field, the 8 years of relative peace at Alexandria afterwards, all of that comes directly out of what Carl asked him to do. Carl was right about all of it, about the war, about what Rick was becoming, about what was worth saving, about what the future could look like. He was 16. He had been a child during most of the show, and the version of life Rick built afterwards, the version where Michonne raised the kids alongside him, and Alexandria became an actual community with a wall and a school and a small economy. That was Carl's vision actually being implemented. The kid who had been born the night his mother died had grown up to be the moral architect of the post-war world. The death scene itself is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever did. Carl describes a dream of the future to his father. Everyone is happy, everyone is alive, Negan is there too, weirdly, with a beard and a garden. Rick is older and softer, Carl is grown. The dream is not big, it's just ordinary. People at a table, a community at peace. Carl wanted that for them. He couldn't have it for himself. He gave it to Rick as a kind of inheritance, and then he went upstairs and shot himself before he turned, so his father wouldn't have to do it. The show is patient with that scene. It lets it land. There's no big music swell. There's no last-minute rescue. He just goes upstairs and Rick and Michonne sit on the porch, and the gunshot happens off-screen, and that's the end of Carl Grimes. Personal opinion, and you can take this as you will. I never quite forgave the show for killing him. Not because of the writing of the death itself, which was as good as the show ever was, because of the version of Walking Dead we never got to see. The version where Carl grows up and runs Alexandria and becomes the leader his father couldn't quite be. The version where he's there when Rick comes back. The version where he and Judith are siblings as adults, sitting on a porch watching the sun go down. That show would have been better than the show we got in a few specific ways, and the choice to remove him was, I think, the most consequential creative decision the original run ever made. The show recovered mostly, but it lost the kid who had been right about almost everything that mattered. His memory threads through the rest of the show in ways that I find quietly moving. Judith wears his hat. Judith carries his katana, eventually. RJ, the son Rick never met his older brother either. The shadow of Carl is in every conversation Rick has after the death, about Judith, about parenting, about the future. And the conversations Michonne has with the kids, raising them in his absence, are full of him without ever needing to mention his name. He was 16 years old when he died. He had been right about peace. He had been right about who his father needed to be. He had been right about what was worth saving. And he died believing that the people he loved would eventually get the kind of life he wanted them to have. Most of the time in this show, when characters die believing things, the things they believed turn out to be wrong. Carl is one of the very few characters whose dying belief actually came true. The community he asked his father to build did get built. It lasted for years, longer than anyone in the early seasons would have thought possible. That is, I think, the most generous thing the show ever did with a character. It let his dying wish actually come true. It just made him pay the full cost of asking for it. So that's 13 of them. 13 characters, 13 versions of being right. 13 ways the show found of letting people argue for things and lose, and then quietly turn out to have been correct. I want to wind this down gently, because we've been at it for a while, and I'd rather not end on a big point. There isn't really a big point. The point, if there is one, is just that the show kept doing this thing over and over, where it would let a character be correct, and then either kill them or exile them, or quietly write them off screen for 2 seasons. And then a few years later, the universe of the show would slowly turn around and admit that the person had been right. One of the things I like about The Walking Dead, when I think about it across its whole run, is how often the show let its small moments matter more than its big ones. The fan-favourite scenes are usually the explosions, the deaths, the cliffhangers, the bat in the dirt, the helicopter, the bridge. Those are great pieces of television, and I've watched them as many times as anyone. But the moments that hold up best on rewatch, for me, are usually conversations. 2 people on a porch, someone walking back from a fence. A small disagreement that turns out to have been about something bigger than it looked. Most of the characters in this list lost the argument at the time. Dale lost the Randall vote. Herschel lost on hope. Andrea lost on the governor. Maggie lost the forgiveness debate for years before being vindicated. Carol got exiled. Eugene was beaten unconscious by his best friend. Carl died. The pattern is consistent enough that I think it has to be deliberate. The show, whether it intended to or not, is a record of people being right about things and not being heard. That's one of the more honest things fiction can do, because that is genuinely what real life does too. Most of the time, when somebody's correct about a hard situation, the people around them are not in a position to receive that information. The information has to come back around through somebody else, or through a tragedy, or through a few extra years of getting it wrong on your own before anyone can accept it. That's just what being right in a group looks like. The show captured that, accidentally or on purpose, more accurately than most fiction does. The spin-offs have continued the pattern in their own way. Daryl in France, picking up his old habits in a country where he doesn't speak the language, and turning out to read rooms just as accurately as he ever did. Maggie and Negan in Manhattan, with Maggie still refusing to forgive him, and the show finally letting her keep that line. Rick and Michonne in The Ones Who Live, the long, slow vindication of Michonne's instinct that he had still been alive somewhere out there. Each of those shows, in its way, is the universe slowly admitting that someone in the original run had been right about something. I should mention before I wrap up that I deliberately left a few characters off the list, and I wanted to flag that because some of them probably should have been in here, and I just couldn't fit everyone. Beth Green is one. She held onto a version of hope after her father was gone that was, in retrospect, what the entire group was trying to find. Tyrese, with his enormous heart and his slowness to violence, was right in his own way about what it cost to keep killing. The moral cost finally caught up with him, and he died believing the people he had lost were waiting for him. Father Gabriel grew, slowly, into a kind of moral grounding that Herschel had carried earlier, and his arc deserves its own conversation. Jesus, Paul Rovia, was right about the Saviour's War being a war that would damage the people who fought it as much as the people they fought against. Sasha, in her last act, found a way to die on her own terms that turned out to be the thing that broke Negan's grip on the war. Dwight, of all people, was eventually right about how to undo the world he had helped build. There are others. There are always others. If you've been listening this far and you have a favourite I missed, fair enough. You can keep them in your head. And maybe I'll do another one of these down the line. And you can tell me to put them in. Personal note before I land. The character whose rightness lands hardest for me on rewatch, and I mention this because the question always comes up, is probably Herschel. The bourbon scene with Rick. The insistence that hope was not optional, even when it cost him his head. I find myself returning to that scene more than almost any other single moment in the show. There's something about the way the actor played him, calm and a bit tired and not at all theatrical, that makes the conversation feel like one that has actually happened in a kitchen somewhere, between a man who has lost too much and a man who is trying not to. The show was full of grand speeches. Herschel's quiet ones tended to land harder than most of them. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll genuinely wrap up, what I find satisfying about this kind of pattern, on a show that ran for as long as this one did, is that it gives you permission to take the unloved characters seriously. Andrea, Eugene, even Negan in his complicated way. The show, if you're paying attention, kept handing these characters moments where they were correct, and then letting the audience react to them as if they were wrong. That mismatch between what the character was actually saying and how the audience was being asked to receive it is the kind of texture that makes a show worth rewatching. The first time through, you watch the show. The second time through, you watch the characters. The third time through, you start watching the arguments, and you start noticing who, in any given scene, is actually being correct, regardless of how the room reacts to them. That's the joy of long shows, honestly. They give you enough material to disagree with the framing. They give you enough hours that you can build your own version of who was right about what. The Walking Dead, for all its mistakes and all its bad decisions and all the things it fumbled along the way, gave you that. 11 seasons, hundreds of episodes, a cast of characters so large that you could find a dozen of them who, on close inspection, had been right about things the show had never quite admitted out loud. Anyway, that's enough from me for one night. If you've been falling asleep through this, I hope you slept well. If you stayed awake, I hope you got something out of it. I'll probably do another one of these at some point. Maybe the characters who were wrong all along, although that one might run a bit long. Take care of yourselves, sleep well, and I'll catch you in the next one.